Hey everyone, welcome to today's Tech Talk. My name is Jenny and I am the Director of Marketing here at TechChange. And with me today is the CIO of the FCC, David Bray. David, welcome. We're so excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Jenny.
Yeah, of course. For everyone who's new here, we do these Tech Talks pretty frequently. We just last week had the Executive Director of the Mozilla Foundation. Prior to that, we had Jack Andraka. I don't know if you know him. He's the teen scientist, TED speaker, came up with a really amazing way to detect pancreatic and other cancers early. Really neat. We've also had the folks who are using 3D printing to create prosthetics, as well as a doctor who was working in Ebola-stricken countries on data collection. So very cool cohort of people who have done these. If you've missed any of those Tech Talks, just head over to techchange.org/events. You'll be able to see the past ones as well as this one, which will be recorded. We also have a team standing by to take your questions, so feel free to tweet us at TechChange using the hashtag AskDavidBray. Shoot your questions over, and towards the end, we'll be able to take them. So before we dive in, I'm going to tell our audience a little bit about you. There are a lot of achievements under your belt. I am going to try and list just a few. You started working with the U.S. government when you were 15.
I was crazy enough to, yes.
Yeah, on computer simulations. You worked at Yahoo, Microsoft partner firm. You deployed to Afghanistan voluntarily.
Yes.
To work with NATO forces, correct? On like how to think differently with military and humanitarian issues.
Yes, both issues.
Yeah. Then you received a National Intelligent Exceptional Achievement Award. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And most recently, you are the CIO of the FCC. It's been almost 2 years, right? When's your 2-year anniversary?
Yep, it's coming up in a month.
Oh my gosh, it's so exciting. And one of your favorite titles that I personally love is he has been named the most social CIO by Forbes. So as a marketer, I very much appreciate that title.
Thanks.
Yeah. So just to get us started, for folks who may not know, tell us a little bit about the FCC and sort of what your role is there, what that looks like.
Sure. So the Federal Communications Commission is about 1,750 people, 18 different bureaus and offices, and our scope since 1934 has been anything wired or wireless involving communications in the United States. And we're meant to be that sort of broker between the public interest and private sector, recognizing that most of telecom in the United States is done by the private sector.
Yeah.
But how do you also then represent the public interest as well? And so my role is I'm a nonpartisan senior executive, which means I am not sided with either party, and I serve both R's and D's. And at the FCC, we do currently have 5 commissioners. We currently have 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. And my goal is often to sort of serve as broker, but then be focused most importantly on the IT issues that we're doing at the commission. That includes the internal IT. When I arrived, like I said, about 23 months ago, they had 207 different systems for an agency of only 1,750 people.
Oh my gosh.
Which is never a good sign. And more than half of them were more than 10 years old. And so this is often a theory I have, not just FCC. Organizations always do great on the outside what they forget to do on the inside.
Yeah.
And so FCC, obviously, back in 1996 was very big with internet and everything like that. They forgot to do it inside as well. So it was a big question of how do we get out of this sort of legacy trap of where we're spending more than 80% of our IT budget on our internal systems.
Yeah.
And what we've done essentially is we've gone straight to the cloud as much as we can. And as opposed to trying to individually update each of these 207 systems, which would easily take 5 or 6 years, I'd be there forever, I embraced what I called entrepreneurs or change agents, which was the idea that almost operating like a VC, venture capitalist on the inside, if people came and pitched ideas as to how we could accelerate moving the system straight to the cloud, or a different way we could move faster on the actual processes we were doing, I asked them first 3 reasons why should we do it. Then I'd ask them 3 reasons why we shouldn't. And then if they had 3 ways they were going to mitigate or address why it's not, who's going to resist it? Because you often don't think about who's going to resist your change, because there's always going to be someone who's going to resist your change. If they had 3 good answers, then I invested in them. And so we actually had one example where we had a consumer help desk. It was 15 years old. Literally, you had to download 18 different PDFs, fill out the paper form, mail it into the FCC. We'd scan it. Wasn't good at all. So we were looking around for what the best options were. Private sector, some of them heralded some of their successes with help desks that were 3.2 million and took 18 months to do. And I was like, I don't have 3.2 million, and I don't have 18 months. So what we did was one of our change agents by the name of Dusty Lown actually made a pitch to say, well, why don't we go with a software as a service offering, which got it done in less than 6 months. In fact, it was only 3 months for the tech, 3 months to then help the bureau and office get past the fact that their data was not on site, and it was only $450,000.
It's amazing.
And that includes contractor time. So, and then the most interesting thing is about a month ago in Forbes, we had someone, we didn't even know this was coming, someone wrote an article and said how the FCC saved me $1,800. And they were just talking about how this new website, because it was so easy to use. I mean, you don't have to figure out which form you're doing. You just sort of walk through what's the nature of your complaint, and it's really that simple.
Yeah.
They said they were able to resolve a dispute with a provider and actually save $1,800.
That's amazing. And you're mentioning Dusty. That saved y'all close to $3 million, something like that? Yeah, that's pretty incredible.
Just in the first year, and then on top of it, we're saving $500,000 each year in that we don't have to pay for maintaining the servers on site.
That's amazing. So I'm a big fan of entrepreneurship. We are here as well at Tech Change being a social enterprise. I think I mentioned to you earlier in Meeting Lean Startup, where it talked about this really big company where they were implementing these philosophies internally and how these great products came out of that. So big company, big government with bureaucracy. I think most people that hear U.S. government oftentimes associate that with bureaucracy. I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear what's being done at the FCC. I'm curious to hear what were your biggest challenges and roadblocks with bringing this sort of mindset and changing the culture there?
Right. So I think our biggest challenge is that we just simply aren't a startup. We can adopt a startup mentality most definitely, but again, we're an 80-year-old organization.
Yeah.
And I think one has to respect that in that I really don't want every part of the United States to be acting like a startup. I mean, the last thing you want is the Department of Defense to say, sorry, we need another round of venture capital fund. Can you give us another $1 trillion? It's like, you can't, and the way I sort of explain it to people is we are in a period of exponential change.
Yeah.
And I think, in particular, Gen Y, millennials, we know it's changing exponentially because we're living through it, but it's really nice to put it into raw numbers so people can understand how big the change is. So 2013, 7 billion people on the face of the planet, 7 billion network devices.
Yeah.
Guess how many devices are here now?
How many?
14 billion.
Oh my gosh.
So it's already doubled in 2 years.
Yeah.
By the time you get to 2022, anywhere between 75 and 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet will only be 8 billion people.
Yeah.
So the number of network devices will vastly outnumber the number of people on the planet. On top of it, data is doubling every 2 years. So by the time you get to 2022, there will be more data on the face of the planet than all human eyes see in the course of a year, which is equal to more data than all human conversations for the history of our species times 2.
Oh my gosh.
So
it's mind-boggling
to try
and think about that amount of data.
And so startups have the opportunity of starting from scratch in this rapidly changing world. But even then, I think startups that start now will be feeling the same pains of ossification and dare I say it, even bureaucracy 7 years from now, because the world of 7 years from now will be vastly different from the world of 2015.
Yeah.
That said, I don't want everything always being a startup just because there's certain things that you want to persist even beyond 2015 and 2022. So I think the challenge that we have to explain is whereas Silicon Valley can fail fast and fail often, if we tried fail fast and fail often, I think the taxpayers would probably have a revolt and say, no, you're not meant to fail.
Yeah.
But the trouble then is if you're not meant to fail, and if you're not allowed to take risk, how do you actually deal with the fact there's no textbook for the world we're going into?
Yeah.
And so that's the art of being a change agent within a legacy organization, whether it be a private organization or a public sector organization, is you have to figure out how do you take calculated risks that are, I often say my job is to be human flak jacket for the team, because I know things aren't always going to work out, but we need to be able to, take those risks and experiment. At the same time, if you don't experiment, you don't take risks, you won't adapt. So that's again why I often ask people not just 3 reasons why we should do this, but 3 reasons as to who's going to resist this change, and have 3 reasons as to how you're going to mitigate it. So the other thing that I also like to tell people is public service is doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was to prevent the rise of the king. I mean, you have to remember in the United States, we fought a war against the king, and the last thing we want is some one person in charge dictating all the shots. But then people will say, well, it's too slow, or it takes forever to get things done, or you have to build a coalition. I'm like, I like that, because at least it's a checks and balances with human rights. I mean, it's not like we can say, sorry, your house is where we want to put this interstate, you have no recourse, tomorrow that interstate is going to be over your house. I mean, there's so many checks and balances that it would resist that. So it's really about how do I, wearing this camouflage, and this is camouflage, how do I as a senior executive with most of my peers in their late 50s or 60s present something to them where we can get through the resistance to change and the resistors, and at the same time I can then turn to my change agents and say, run as fast as you can. If you get any flack, send it to me. and we'll move forward together.
So you mentioned the suit is camouflage. I have to ask, what would be your actual uniform every day to work? Is it a hoodie? Do you wanna?
T-shirt and blue jeans.
T-shirt and blue jeans. All right. Is that where the FCC is heading in 10 years?
Our developers wear them. I mean, our developers
Nice.
can. But I knew, so let me give another story. So in a different role than this one, and that was where you mentioned when I was with a national commission that was reviewing the research and development efforts of the intelligence community. There had been 3 senior executives in 3 months that didn't work out prior to my arrival. The first one was not seen as aggressive enough, and so they got sent back. The second one was seen as they would ask the hard-hitting questions and actually look underneath the surface of things, but they didn't do a good job communicating with the Republican and Democratic co-chairs. And like I said, as a nonpartisan, I have to work across both parties.
Yep.
And if you don't do that, you're dead.
Right.
The third one, literally in black sweater and black blue jeans, a la Steve Jobs, got in front of Congress and claimed the intelligence community was like a tree. And I'm sure there was some interesting Silicon Valley-esque West Coast vibes there.
Yeah.
But you can imagine that didn't fly over too well.
Yeah.
And so that's where I often tell people the other thing is there's leadership and management.
Yep.
Management is when you do what's expected of you. And we all, to a certain point in time, have to do what's expected of us, whether it's from our boss, our peers, or even our reports. If you don't do what your reports want, to a degree, they may revolt as well. Leadership, however, is when you intentionally step outside of expectations.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that the root of the word leadership is the word lead, which means to send unto death. And you might say, well, what the heck does that have to do with leadership? Well, back in ancient Greece, the melee army, the elites were the ones that carried the flag in front of the melee army. One melee army meets another melee army. Who's the first to die? The elites. So when you're going to be doing leadership, you need to be aware of you're taking on risks that you might quote-unquote die. Maybe not physically, but you might, be kicked out of your job. And so I often tell people, I want you to be leaders. I'm going to be a leader. But have a strategy to manage the friction that will be incurred when you try to create that change. Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment actually was when he actually had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and say, we're going to make peace with the white minority. He almost had a coup.
Yeah.
Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, when he said he was going to make peace with the Palestinians, it was actually an Israeli that assassinated him. And so you have to be aware of how much change and how much friction your following can tolerate such that you get them to ideally the quote-unquote promised land, but at the same time, they don't kill you in the process.
Yeah, it's such an interesting balance to strike. And I think for a lot of people out there watching, and myself as well, being a leader in a very fast-growing startup, everything you said resonates so much. Like, you're beholden to certain people, you're trying to innovate, but you don't want to die, but you have to take, there's just so many things that are going on there. Yep. What other advice would you have for people, whether they're in the C-suite or just they're in a company or an organization and they want to bring innovation to the table? What can they do? What should be their next steps?
The narrative. Find out the existing narratives even before you try to impose your narrative onto an organization. So this is key whether it's in a startup. I mean, startups have to have narratives as to what are they doing, what's their reason for being, but also existing legacy organizations. You have to recognize there are several historical narratives that exist in that organization.
Yeah.
And one of the things I often do when I first arrive is I'll pay for coffee and donuts and just say, I'm going to be here between 9 and 11. Anyone who wants coffee and donuts, come, have a conversation.
I love that.
And I use that as almost intelligence gathering within the organization as to what the narratives are going on. And also, it's goodwill, too. I mean, it's sugar and coffee. The other thing is just tell people, honestly, when you arrive, say, I know I have a lot to listen and learn. I hope I can listen and learn a lot from you. And so that humbleness makes you open to hearing from them. I often say there's also a Harvard Business Review article, 2007, that says, in praise of incomplete leaders.
I read that.
I highly recommend that one. Tom Malone was actually my postdoc, one of my postdoc
We'll
advisors.
be sure to share that out for everyone watching because it's really a great read.
But I think saying that we all have blind spots and saying, I know I'm going to have blind spots, that helps put people in a place where they feel comfortable, one, letting you know if you're missing something, which is a good thing, because you may, and in fact you will miss things. But equally, the fact that you've now made yourself vulnerable to them makes them more likely to make themselves vulnerable to you. And then finally, one thing I like to do when I arrive too is I try to meet with people and say, what brings you joy? Yeah. And that often catches people off guard. They're like, well, why are you asking this? And I'm like, I just honestly want to know what brings you joy at work, because that puts them in a reflective state. And in particular, you'll find people that may have been as passionate as maybe you and I were, but maybe somewhere along the line they tried to create change and they hit their head against the wall so many times that they gave up.
Yeah.
But if you can reignite that spark, you'll find allies in places that you never knew existed.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned coffee and donuts as a way for intelligence gathering.
Yes.
But as I mentioned, he was named by Forbes Most Social CIO. And I know you've really used social media a lot for not just engaging with the public, but with your employees as well. Tell us a little bit about how you've used social media and other technology to really connect and spark that innovation and passion.
Sure. So I honestly had never had a social media account until I arrived at the FCC, not because I wasn't aware of it, I didn't want to have one. It's just obviously in my line of work, when you're in Afghanistan, the last thing you want to do is, hi, here I am in this location.
Here's my coordinates.
Not a good idea.
Yeah.
And then also when I was at the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program, again, not like, hi, we're going to go respond to this event now. No. Certain things you just don't do. So I intentionally arrived and I said I'd like to create a FCC Twitter account, FCC_CIO. And they said, well, why do you want that account? And I was like, well, we are communications. It's a real name. And they said, well, you can do that. Just don't have FCC in it. I was like, have you Googled FCC, Foreign Correspondence of China? We're not a unique acronym.
Right.
And so, again, it's stepping outside of expectations, and I just went ahead and did it. And so FCC_CIO exists. And it was intentional because I looked under the hood and saw how challenging things were going to be with our old IT legacy systems. And then again, that there had been 9 CIOs in 8 years prior to my arrival that probably all had looked at this, whatever reasons, did some calculations and went somewhere else, or just didn't work out.
Yeah.
So I needed to be able to have that conversation with the public, which is we've had sequestration, we've had tight budgets. In a perfect world, we'd have as much money. In fact, FCC is 100% brought in through licenses and auctions. So we actually don't receive money from the taxpayers in that sense.
Okay.
But that said, we don't get to keep all the money we bring in. Right. We recently had an auction that was an auction for spectrum that was estimated to bring in 7 to 11 billion, brought in 44.9. But all that money goes to pay down the debt. So
I was about to say, did you buy like extra special donuts the next day at work?
No, we don't get to have that money goes to pay down the debt, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But it's just like, can I just keep 0.001% to upgrade the IT? Because it'd be nice, but I can't. So we have to operate within the money we've got. And so I often say, we'll do the best we can given the scarce resources we have. But it was intentionally to have that conversation, as well as to say, again, I know I'm going to miss things. I welcome ideas both from the outside public, because I think public service, first and foremost, is the public. It's not government professionals. It is the public. And then it's private sector partners and government professionals working together. But then also as a way to just, with my team, I know they were working hard, and I wanted to identify the people that would really be willing to actually sort of take on this change effort. Because again, they'd seen 9 CIOs in 8 years. It would be very easy for the existing staff to say, he'll be gone in about 9 months, so I'll wait him out.
Yeah.
And so I think when I first arrived, my pulse check was there was about 15% that were willing to be change agents. There was another 40 to 50% that just wanted to wait things out, or they were uncertain, and then another 3% that would prefer to go nowhere. And then a year later it changed.
Yeah. So. And how did you identify those change agents? Was it as simple as coffee, donuts, tell me what brings you joy? Was that kind of like day one, that was what you were going after?
It's a mix. It's several. I mean, yeah, so it's what brings you joy, it's coffee and donuts. It's also, we did happy hours that I would like get people together and just to see who would come and find out what comes up there. It's also just, at the end of the day, the biggest way to figure out who's a change agent is, results speak for themselves.
Yeah.
So if someone comes to you and pitches a great idea, but they don't follow through on it, then maybe I have to help them with the training, or how do they get from point A to point B. And I don't like to tell people how to get from point A to point B. I figure my best way is to give you autonomy, to give you measurable progress, because that helps both you get feedback on how you're doing, but it also helps me know how things are going. And then finally give you a compelling mission. And I was like, this is communications for the United States. I mean, there is no Department of Communications. I don't think there should be.
Yeah.
But this is comms for the United States and ultimately interacting with the rest of the world. So results speak for themselves. I think it was a combination of just coalition of the willing, work with what you've got. The other thing that I also did was, like I said, when I first arrived, got a pulse check. A year in, so normally we have stand-up meetings every 3 weeks. We're just, how are we doing? And I came to one of those meetings. I was like, I'm just going to listen. You tell me how you think things are going.
Yeah.
And at that pulse check, I think we had gone, fortunately, from being 15% to maybe 35% were with it. People were like, things are really going well. We're moving very fast. This is faster than they've ever gone before. And I was like, well, that's good. But there was also another 35% that was like, we're still kind of uncertain. We're not sure. It's a year. You're going to be leaving us soon. And then another 40% that someone wanted to go back. And actually, I had one person who was honest enough, and I appreciated this. He said, I have a beef. And I was like, okay, go ahead. He's like, it happened 17 years ago. I was like, go ahead.
Oh.
And it was some issue, and I listened to it, and I said, well, that's a very valid point. I don't know if I can fix what happened 17 years ago, but we can take that in mind as we move forward together. And we recently just did it again about 2 months ago as well. And I think by that time we've actually grown to about 50 or 55% or now. So we've hit the tipping point.
Amazing.
We're moving. In fact, by the end of this summer, we'll have no servers on site.
Wow.
We'll have either moved straight to the cloud or to a commercially managed service provider. We've gotten out of the business of trying to maintain our own systems, which the FCC for that size should never have tried to do.
Yeah.
That said, one of the most joyful comments that someone said was, it's like Thanksgiving. And I said, could you tell me a little bit more? Because I was only asking questions. I was not meant to give my own views. And he's like, well, it's like Thanksgiving in the sense that you have your dysfunctional family, but everyone's joyful and they're here all together, and it's hope. Everyone's on their best behavior, but there's also hope. And so that, to me, to be able to turn things around in less than 2 years, it's exciting. And then to me, that's actually even more fun and more of a challenge than doing a startup, because it's not a blank slate. It's how do you work with what you got given scarce resources.
I love what you said about autonomy, because one of my favorite lines in my management style is, I need you to get to Chicago by 5 o'clock. I don't care how you get there. I trust you. I know you can do it. As long as you show up by 5, we're great.
Right.
And I feel like as long as the leader has a really solid vision, strategy, and has really put themselves out there and let them know I'm here for you, I think that really motivates people so much and is the fastest way to success and change. So very exciting. So internally, we know you want to move more towards the cloud, building more change agents. What else is next? What's the next 2 years for you look like at the FCC?
Well, that's a good question. I think in some respects I operate, if you look at my history, I change about every 2 or 3 years. So I don't want to tell that I'm going to be changing anytime soon. But I mean, I always like to take on things that have never been done before.
Yeah.
And so back in 2000, it was a small little 30-person program. It was the what if a biological event ever happened, because the sarin gas attacks had happened in 1990, and unfortunately smallpox had been stockpiled by certain nations back in the 70s. So every 6 months, Congress said we didn't need to exist. We were a Cold War relic, and we're like, nah, maybe we do. And it was literally on September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning when I was supposed to brief the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do technology-wise if a biological event happened. Clearly didn't give that briefing because 8:34 the world changed.
Right.
And so we literally piled computers in the car, set up an underground bunker, and dealt with the response to both New York and to DC. Stood down on October 1st after not sleeping. And October 3rd briefed the CIA, and the first case of anthrax shows up on October 4th.
Wow. Talk about fortuitous.
I guess. I say I'm never going to brief him again, but that's me. But to me, that crystallized, I had done private sector, I had done some public sector as well. I actually thought I was going to join the Peace Corps after 2 or 3 years. And I guess in some respects, serving as a nonpartisan senior executive is some part of like being in the Peace Corps. In the sense that
I see a lot of
trying to get them to work together, and you work within sometimes developing nations. But it really is just wherever I can best be of service. And I also look at it as I sometimes feel like I'm like Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Not that I'm ever going to do opium, and he's a fictitious character, but if I don't have a case, I'm really, really bored and I'm sort of lethargic.
Yeah.
But if I have a case where it's never been done before and it's really, really hard, I get excited and I get pumped.
Yeah, it's all about the excitement. I love that.
The game is afoot.
Connect with that so much. So we're going to switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
I am such a big fan of asking anyone as successful as you are, what are your sort of productivity tips and tricks? The sort of cliche question, how do you do it all? I'm sure you have email that's overflowing and, a lot going on into balance. So what are your tips and tricks? And do you use technology to manage a lot of what you have going on?
I do. I'm still waiting for the AI that will actually answer my emails for me. I don't see that yet, but
we'll add it to our list.
Yes. So one, I love to take the metro into work and back because that gives me about 40 minutes when I'm on the metro to triage my email coming into work and triage I do try to intentionally do Twitter going into work and coming back. Email, I think my tip is try to keep what's in your inbox, the actual inbox, down to less than 6. I often try to get to inbox 0.
I'm an inbox 0 person.
Yes.
This is a very big debate in the tech change
and
offices.
It's probably personality differences. I mean, this probably works for me, and I'm not going to say it works for everybody, but it just helps me. And I have a very low-tech solution, which is get a very small notepad, like a detective's notepad.
Yeah.
And that's where I write anything that's still outstanding, and I can only get 1 page a day. So if it doesn't fit on the page, it must not be that important.
I have a notebook and I do the same thing. As much as I'm in tech, I still love pen and paper.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm inbox zero. Our founder, sorry Nick, but he has over 12,000 unread. Oh, it breaks my heart. Every time I see that number, I can just feel my heart rate increasing.
But I think it's different. You have to recognize different personality. The other thing that I would also say, and you were asking about social media and Twitter, be open to the unexpected.
Yeah.
Both in terms of what the day will bring, and both on email and on Twitter. In that there was one time when I was getting ready to go home. It was about 6:30 at night, and Luke Fretwell, I'm going to give him a call out with GovFresh. He sent a note saying, he was talking about how FCC, we do put our code on GitHub. We've had our code be open source for a while, so that way anyone can edit it. And he said, this is great they're using, and I said, I often encourage my coders to use GitHub. And he said, the day that a CIO is on GitHub is the day the world changed. Now, I'm sorry. I think, I love to code, but I think if I'm coding, then Chairman Wheeler is going to have a conversation with me and say, what are you doing?
Let's talk about priorities here.
Sorry.
I remember seeing that in a job description.
It's like, and also, again, I'm supposed to be the human fact checker. So I just politely replied back, and I said, the day that a CIO is on Twitter is the day they're an overpaid programmer. And so Luke, to his credit, then actually created an Ask Me Anything on GitHub.
Yep.
And so I just went with it. So I just decided to clear my schedule and say I'm going to stay in the office and stay here for the next 2 hours. And so we did Ask Me Anything on GitHub. It was great. It was spontaneous. I think he kept on trying to prove that I should show up on GitHub, and I actually created my account, which is Empower Your Coders, as like my subtle hint that it should actually be about the coders, not about the CIO.
Nice.
But things like that you just have to be open to, because again, it's really about the public at the end of the day.
I love that. Before you know it, you're going to be using Periscope in the offices. You're going to be posting videos of you GoProing on a scooter through the hallways in your hoodie. I can't wait for this.
We've talked about that. Actually, not so much any specific app. We did have a surprise event happen a while back where there was a thunderstorm, shut out the power to our facilities. The facilities' backup power came on.
Yeah.
But apparently the air conditioning did not come back on. So we're following up with so our servers got really hot.
Yeah.
So we've actually talked about, should we actually do for like April Fool's Day, like drop it like it's hot, like at the SCC or something like that. But we'll come out. See if there's a music video coming from SCC IT, no guarantees. So.
I love that. Everyone follow along. SCC CIO, you don't want to miss this.
So
all right.
We have fun. But you have to have that. I mean, that's part of the workplace culture too, is to show that even though I'm wearing a suit and tie because I have to, when I show up at Congress, sorry, blue jeans and T-shirt just won't fly.
Yeah.
I mean, even when you have to go to the White House, I think you do have to wear some deference to the buildings. But within the office place, it doesn't mean you can't have as much fun as you're having like at a West place, West Coast place.
There's no reason why we can't have that. I love it. All right, so another topic I wanted to talk about, you were an Eisenhower Fellow in 2013, and you got to travel to Taiwan and Australia. This was around the Internet of Everything. So can you talk a little bit about that experience and what that was about?
Sure. So the Eisenhower Fellowships did it in a personal capacity. So I took leave from work and then used my own personal time. Had a chance to meet with industry and government officials in both Taiwan and Australia, ministers of communications, justice, defense, which is a really unique opportunity, and just talk about, so the Internet of Everything's coming. How are your countries preparing?
Yeah.
And I think probably there's lessons to be gained both here at home, but also across the world, just recognizing that nobody is really ready for the exponential changes that are going to happen.
Yeah.
And that the biggest questions were, how are we going to deal with security? Because this is not going to be a linear change how we're doing security. This is exponential.
Right.
And right now we're still very reliant on humans in the loop. But if something happens at millisecond speeds to do security, humans are going to miss it. It's just going to be cleanup after the fact. Or even worse, I often worry about the attack that deposits 2 or 3 packets a month that by themselves are innocuous.
Yeah.
But if you do it over a 12-month period, then something that's now built into something that's really bad, but no human has that attention span to look at each of the different packets that came in. So I think that's where you see like DARPA right now is pursuing a grand challenge that is to play capture the flag, the equivalent of capture the flag in cyberspace, where it will be human teams versus the computer.
I love that.
And so I think that's an interesting idea. That it's not going to be that computers replace humans, because obviously if the machine themselves gets infected, we got a problem. But it's how do you pair humans and machines together to do things smarter than ever before, whether it be for cybersecurity or even just in the workplace. I mean, we already are having it happen with Surrey and Katana and Watson and things like that.
Yeah.
The other thing was privacy. Increasingly, consumers are getting hit with, and this was in Taiwan and Australia, they both said, they're getting hit with 30 and 40-page end-user agreements that, unless we really read, and who has the time to do that, we just click accept. How do we make it so it could be much more like a conversation where your device could say, in Taiwan, the conversation was, in fact, one of the ministers said, I'd like to have a device that said, would you be willing to share your healthcare data with company X? And you might say no.
Yeah.
And it says, okay. Would you be willing to share your healthcare data with company X in the event of a car crash? And you might say yes at that point in time. But it's a conversation as opposed to a 40-page in-user agreement that's either yes or no at the end.
Right. I think it's important because it's not black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of ways we're still treating it that way, and there's a lot of gray area here. So in your capacity as an Eisenhower Fellow, I'm going to read a tweet that somebody said, which, so we're launching a course on digital safety in a few weeks, and our fabulous facilitator and director of pedagogy here, Norman Seamus, he's all about digital security. He sent me this tweet that you seem to actually get the hacker mentality needed in InfoSec, and Norman said that was the highest compliment that anybody could receive. And so what do you think some of the ways that security professionals and policymakers need to interact in order to help improve the state of digital security worldwide? And so talking a little bit about that from your experiences as a fellow.
Yeah, so so that was actually at the U.S. Cyber Challenge last week on Friday in Delaware. And that's where, again, these are some really great folks, college age, that are playing capture the flag with each other, and they're learning tips and techniques to be white hat hackers. And I guess apparently what I said must have resonated. I guess I might be able to, again, I was 15 working for the government, doing some computer stuff. You can figure out what that might have been. So maybe I know a little bit about what it's like to be a change agent. I think if I was to draw from my experiences as an Eisenhower Fellow in Australia and Taiwan, I would say, first and foremost, you have to recognize that TCP/IP was never built to be secure. Back in the days that it was rolled out, it was only being used by the Department of Defense on ARPANET. And the way they did actual security was you badged into the facility in person, and it was your a computer that was a dedicated DoD terminal, which clearly we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
So that's fine. I don't think we can replace TCP/IP anytime soon. We can maybe add to it or upgrade it, but the inherent protocol itself fundamentally was never built to be completely secure. In fact, there's some things. Border Gateway Protocol, for example, is open authentication. So you can claim to be in another country if you want to be. And I don't recommend that, but so that said, it's the question of not so much having 100% security. I mean, here we are here today, not to make anyone nervous, but there's nothing that prevents anyone from getting in a car and trying to drive it into this facility and trying to blow it up or doing worse, or hold us hostage or take it. So, you know, that's the nature of the real world. The real world is dangerous, but at the same time, it doesn't happen every day.
Right.
So how can we do that same thing, which is we're not looking at the internet as being 100% secure, but what we're trying to do is a risk-based approach that's much more about minimizing the dwell time of anything that is less than desirable on your network.
Yeah.
At the same time, one of the things that I would also recommend, I heard this actually encouraged in Australia and Taiwan, is I think we need to encourage more of a do-it-yourself, almost hacker culture.
Yeah.
And again, part of what I think is great about democracy is we celebrate individual freedoms. I think we should actually encourage that same thing, which is, why can't you remix things on your own? That's why I'm a big fan of open source, open APIs. But that same idea is that maybe could be part of our branding, not just as a country but as a world, which is products should be remixable. At the same time, products should be able to send you alerts if something is occurring that you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
It could be a software issue, it could be a hardware issue, but it also could be someone's trying to do something to it that you're not expecting. So the analogy I look at, again coming from public health and bioterrorism, at the federal level of the government, we do not know who you are if a public health event is happening. We just know signs, symptoms, and demographics.
Right.
And that's sufficient enough to respond to the event. The local level knows who the person specifically is. So what if we created a space in which people could voluntarily share almost signs and symptoms of what their devices are doing, which would allow us to establish a baseline of what's normal. And this could be your car, this could be your phone, this could be different things like that, and you share it anonymously, so we don't know it's coming from you. It's been de-identified. But in the event that your device all of a sudden starts showing signs that is odd, it may just be it missed an upgrade or something like that, someone could notify you, much like public health, saying something odd is going on here. It might be a hardware or software issue, or it might be someone's trying to mess with your car and you don't want to drive your car in 100% automatic mode right now until we figure out what it is. And so that might make it a better approach, which is public health, as opposed to putting it underneath, say, some either military or some homeland security function.
Yeah, really interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the audience. First one up is Sarah wants to know what you learned during your time in Afghanistan, and if there are any similar patterns you saw in the military that you kind of see happen in the government, what you kind of learned from that experience. Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So I came in late January 2009. So the administration had just changed, and they wanted someone that was nonpartisan, actually with a scientist background, to parachute in. So it was actually, I mean, I would easily do it again in a heartbeat, even though, people say, well, why have you served in Afghanistan? I had carte blanche to talk to military, to talk to civilian, to talk to local Afghans. I think that's where I, reaffirmed my appreciation of understanding people's narratives.
Yeah.
Because there were many different views on the issue. Again, now I was in the role in which I was to identify problems they didn't know were problems yet, with the permission that if they didn't like what I wrote, they would bury it. So I had to be willing to raise up ideas, and if they didn't like it, they would kill them. Or if they did like it, they would claim they wrote them themselves. So you would never actually see my name in print. So you have to be that willing, but that gives you access. So one of the things that I keyed in closely was, why were we burning the poppies? And so this wasn't even an IT issue at all. And at the time, the story back in 2009 was we were burning the poppies because they were somehow funding the Taliban. And what's interesting is if you actually look at the narratives and you talk to local Afghans, you talk to civilians, and you get the history, in fact, it's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence of local governors or warlords and Taliban. They don't necessarily overlap. And on top of it, the price of poppies had been intentionally manipulated long before we even showed up.
Yeah.
That some people had interpreted the Quran as saying, it's against the Quran to have mind-altering substances, so don't grow these poppies. But they only said that after they bought them all. So they bought them all, and then they did an artificial price control. And then they had to go out on the market.
Yeah.
And so they sold them. They ran out of the supply because morphine base is actually stable for several years. And then they ran out of the supply, so they came back and said, well, you're actually not hurting us, so you can go back and growing them again. So by us showing up and trying to burn the poppies, we were actually driving up the price and actually making those who were trying to profit nefariously actually bigger profit margins.
Yeah.
So I said, maybe we should stop that and instead try to do alternative crops. Maybe we should also try and focus on precursor chemicals that are used only to actually create heroin and opium. And then just help the local farmers. Because the other thing you also realized was Afghanistan back in the 1950s was a breadbasket, actually, in Central Asia. The trouble is it had, with the Soviets and things that had followed since then, it had actually lost its irrigation systems and things like that. Yeah. I guess the other thing I would look back in Afghanistan is I was extremely impressed with the professionalism of the military, which is actually not a story you get. I mean, there was a group of what's called SAMS grads, which are the School of Advanced Military Studies, where we would get together for either lunch or dinner, and they could debate the difference between chaos theory and complexity theory.
Oh, I love it.
Which was, I mean, these are stories you don't get told as to how much they get trained. And also, I mean, the question I asked them, everyone I asked is, why are we still here? Which was fun to get those different answers. And so the other thing that I look back at is my father's a Methodist minister, just retired. Whether it's military, whether it's public service, whether it's even private sector, these settings are a lot like church in the sense that people mean well, but boy, are there differences on how they get the job done.
Yeah.
And so the art of leadership is how do you actually craft that narrative in a way that's compelling, and I often try to back it with data because that's just sort of, again, being a scientist, I feel like you can't just have an opinion, you actually have to have data to support it.
Totally.
But the good news is I think looking back, I think a lot of things were changed that were not working out because we actually did take a hard look and actually say, what are we missing?
Yeah.
In terms of looking at government, I think that's the same thing. I think here's an institution that's more than 200 years old. The world is changing very, very rapidly. And it's easy to say it's broken or give soundbite answers and say it's just dysfunctional or a bureaucrat's a bureaucrat. But the truth is much more complex than that.
Yeah.
And I don't think those stories often get told. I think the other thing that's not being told is, and I'm not a political, but the story that's also not being told is if politics is the art of compromise, and that's what we want. We want actual people to compromise because we don't want a king. We don't want a dictator. If we do want a king, there's dictatorships, and we can consider those countries. I feel like the internet has removed the ability for politicians to effectively compromise. And what I mean by this is back in the 1950s and 1960s, if you were a politician, you could go to your constituent and say, look at the deal I got you. And you didn't have to tell the other side of the story, which is what did you give up?
Right.
But now on the internet, if you say, look at what I got you, someone else is going to say, BS, you gave this up.
Yeah.
And so you see moderates on both sides of the aisle choosing not to run anymore. And actually Pew Research is now saying 2014 was the most extreme between both sides. And so the question is can the way we do representative democracy, which is a two-party system that has some adversaries, and it's intentionally adversarial. You go back to the Federalist Papers, 1788, they wanted ambition to counter ambition. if that's the case, can we still do that in the age in which the internet has made everything open and transparent?
I think it's a really interesting question because we're not Luddites. We don't want to smash technology, but there's so many pros and cons to what we've seen proliferate and happen. And what do we do? What's
we just
next?
have to adapt it. I think we have to say that what we're seeing is signs and symptoms of stress being put on the system in ways it never expected before.
Yeah.
But then that's where we can go back to where Ben Franklin said, supposedly he said when the Constitution was signed, he said, I can rest easy knowing that the great American experiment will exist for the next 50 years. Now, that was 50 years. We're probably 150 years past that.
Yeah.
But again, it's owing that it's an experiment. But the question is, so let me give you one more story real quick.
Yeah.
Ensign Nimitz. Most people don't know who he was. 1908, Ensign Nimitz ran his boat aground with the U.S. Navy. He was USS Decatur. He ran his boat aground. He was court-martialed but not drummed out of the Navy and assigned to submarines. 35 years later, he became one of only 2 5-star admirals we ever had in the U.S. Navy, and was essential to helping us win the war in the Pacific. Play this out now. Young ensign, probably would have been ensign, lieutenant commander, runs his boat aground in the Philippines. How long would it be on Twitter? How long would it be on social media? How many television, both pundits and comedians would have been like, what was Nimitz thinking, and fire Nimitz? And then his boss and his boss's boss probably would have been called to Congress, and they probably would have all been out of jobs. And so we would have lost someone that had taken a mistake and learn from it early in their career. And so the question is, are we tolerant of those people that take risk and don't always succeed early in their career, such that by the time they get further in their career, they're actually experienced and seasoned? Or are we selecting for people that never take any risk at all, and then they become leaders?
Yeah. Very fascinating. All right, we are running low on time, so we are going to end here with some rapid-fire questions. All right. So my goal when I do interviews, I'm sure you get asked a lot of the same things over and over again. So I've got a few here that we put together.
And these are secret, I've heard.
These are secret, so everyone knows he has not seen these. These are very serious questions. All right, so first thing that comes to mind. Ready? Favorite DC restaurant?
Circle Bistro.
Okay. Person you'd most like to have dinner with, dead or alive?
I say this, my wife. And she's alive.
So, favorite show you like to binge watch?
Favorite show I like to binge watch? I guess actually the Jeremy Brett versions of Sherlock Holmes.
Nice. Okay. Is that the UK?
That's the UK older version, not the new one, but it's the ones that were done in the 80s with Jeremy.
I have to watch those.
Highly recommended.
Okay, because I'm a big fan of the UK Sherlock right now. Last book you read?
Last book I read was The Player of Games by Ian M. Banks.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to have to check that out. Country you haven't yet visited but want to?
Antarctica.
And finally, the most important question, favorite cupcake shop in DC?
I don't actually know of any.
Georgetown Cupcakes, baked and wired. Oh,
sorry,
we're gonna have to. All right, we're gonna have to. Next time, instead of donuts and coffee, it's gonna be cupcakes and coffee. You have to do a sampling and a poll between Georgetown, Sprinkles, baked and wired, and let us know who wins.
All right.
Cupcakes are great. All right, so everyone, thank you so much. Reminder to follow David on Twitter at FCC_CIO, and TechChange, we're at TechChange. Make sure you also check out TechChange's newest diploma program in technology for monitoring and evaluation that will be launching this fall. And as we mentioned, our digital safety course is starting in a few short weeks. We're very excited about it. Just head over to techchange.org and click courses. Stay tuned for future Tech Talks. David, thank you again so much for being here with us. Really had a great time, and thanks for everyone for participating. Have a great day, y'all.